The night air was thick with tension as the red and blue lights of the police cruiser illuminated the quiet street. Jamal Carter had just left his office, exhausted from another long day as a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, he carried a worn leather briefcase, an ironic symbol of the very justice system that was about to turn against him. As he stepped toward his black BMW, parked neatly on the curb, he noticed the patrol car slowing to a stop beside him. He sighed. He had seen this scenario play out before, not just in the news, but in his own life. Two officers emerged, hands resting casually on their holsters. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rigid posture, took the lead. "Hey you," the officer barked. "What are you doing out here?" Jamal kept his voice even, knowing that any sign of irritation could escalate things. "Just leaving work, heading home." The second officer, a younger man with nervous eyes, glanced at his partner before stepping forward. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description." Jamal frowned. "This is my car. I can show you my registration and ID." But before he could reach into his briefcase, the first officer's tone sharpened. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see 'em." Jamal hesitated. He had spent years defending cases just like this, innocent men detained on baseless suspicion. He knew how quickly things could spiral. "I'm an attorney," he said slowly. "I know my rights." "Yeah?" The first officer smirked. "Then you know resisting won't end well." The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, but his partner was already reaching for his cuffs. "Turn around." Jamal clenched his jaw. He could argue, but it wouldn't matter. Not yet. So he did as he was told. Cold steel snapped around his wrists. Then, as they shoved him against the car, he spoke the words that would change everything. "You might want to let me make a call. My brother is the U.S. Attorney General. If you like to fight for justice, subscribe now." For a moment, there was silence. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of Jamal's words hanging between them like an unspoken threat. "The U.S. Attorney General?" the younger cop repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. Jamal didn't bother repeating himself. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to lock eyes with the older officer. "I suggest you check my ID before this becomes something much bigger than a traffic stop." But the senior officer, Sergeant Daniels, according to his name tag, scoffed. "Nice try. Everyone's got a story when they're caught." Jamal exhaled sharply through his nose. He had handled wrongful arrest cases for years, but now, the irony of being in the very position he fought against wasn't lost on him. "Search my wallet," he said, keeping his voice controlled. "It's in my inside jacket pocket." The younger cop hesitated. "Sarge, maybe we should—" "No," Daniels cut him off. "Not here, not now." He turned to Jamal. "We'll verify everything at the station." Jamal's patience thinned. He had seen officers like Daniels before, the kind who refused to back down, even when they were wrong. "That's a mistake," Jamal said calmly. "But go ahead, take me in. Just know that in about 5 minutes your phone is going to ring, and when it does, you're going to wish you had listened." Daniels smirked. "I'm shaking." Without another word, he tightened his grip on Jamal's arm and guided him toward the squad car. Jamal didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because he knew exactly what was coming next. The squad car's back seat smelled of sweat and old vinyl, but Jamal barely noticed. He sat still, his hands cuffed behind him, his heartbeat steady. He had been in tight situations before, interrogating corrupt officials, defending innocent men against wrongful convictions, but never like this. Sergeant Daniels sat in the front seat, smug, convinced he had the upper hand. The younger officer, who Jamal now heard Daniels call Reeves, kept stealing uncertain glances at him in the rearview mirror. "You're really sticking to that story?" Reeves finally asked. Jamal turned his head slightly. "It's not a story. It's a fact," Daniels snorted. "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States." He put the car into gear, pulling away from the curb. Jamal tilted his head back against the seat, his tone casual but laced with warning. "If you don't believe me, at least let me make my one call. You know the law, right?" Daniels ignored him, but Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "It's protocol, Sarge," he muttered. Daniels exhaled through his nose. "Fine, let's hear this so-called Attorney General brother of yours." Jamal didn't hesitate. He recited the number from memory. Daniels put it on speaker, smirking. The phone rang once, twice. Then a crisp, authoritative voice answered. This is Attorney General Carter. Silence filled the car. Daniels blinked. Reeves stiffened. Jamal allowed himself the smallest smirk. Elijah, Jamal said smoothly, his voice calm despite the handcuffs. We have a situation. Daniels' fingers twitched on the steering wheel. Reeves swallowed hard, and just like that, the entire power dynamic shifted. For a moment, the only sound in the squad car was the hum of the engine. Sergeant Daniels' face lost a fraction of its smugness, but his pride wouldn't let him back down, at least not yet. Jamal? Attorney General Elijah Carter's voice was sharp with concern. What kind of situation? Jamal adjusted his shoulders against the cuffs. I was just arrested, Elijah. Something about a stolen vehicle that just so happens to be mine. On the other end of the line, silence. Then the slight inhale of someone barely restraining their anger. Who arrested you? Elijah's voice was calmer now, but only in the way a storm goes quiet before it hits. Daniels shifted in his seat, glancing at Reeves, who looked like he wanted to disappear into thin air. Daniels cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Look, sir, whoever you are, we're just following standard procedure. Your brother fit a description, and Elijah cut him off. Sergeant, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. I don't tolerate unlawful arrests, especially not when they involve my family. Daniel sat up straighter, his grip tightening on the wheel. We were just doing our job. If there's a mistake, we'll clear it up at the station. Jamal chuckled softly, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? He glanced at the phone. Elijah, how long until their phone rings? Give it 30 seconds, his brother replied. I'm making some calls now. Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what was worse, the realization that he had just arrested the brother of the most powerful prosecutor in the country, or the fact that his phone was about to ring with orders that could end his career. Jamal sat back, satisfied. You boys are about to learn a very important lesson. Sergeant Daniels kept his eyes on the road, but his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Officer Reeves, now visibly anxious, pulled out his phone and refreshed his notifications like a man waiting for bad news. Jamal, still calm, watched them both. He had been in too many courtrooms to miss the telltale signs of men realizing they'd made a mistake. Then, just as Elijah had promised, the first call came in. Daniel's phone vibrated against the dashboard. He hesitated, then snatched it up. Daniels, he answered, voice steady, too steady, a pause. Then his entire demeanor changed. Yes, sir. No, sir. Understand, sir. Jamal smirked. That didn't take long. Reeves's phone rang next. He jumped, scrambling to answer. Officer Reeves speaking. Oh, yes, Captain. No, sir, Yes, sir, he's in the car now. No, sir, we didn't know. Daniel slammed a fist against the steering wheel. God damn it. Jamal tilted his head. Something wrong, Sergeant? Daniel shot him a venomous glare but didn't respond. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Jamal turned his attention back to the phone still in his lap. Elijah, I assume that was the police chief? It was, Elijah confirmed, and the mayor and the governor's office. Everyone's very interested in why my brother, an innocent man, was arrested tonight. Reeves visibly paled. Daniels, despite his frustration, finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Jamal shifted in his seat. So, gentlemen, how do we handle this? Daniel's pride fought against his self-preservation, but he knew when he was outmatched. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel like it was the last thing he had control over. He didn't want to say it, but he had no choice. You're free to go. The squad car skidded to a sudden stop at the next intersection. Daniel's grip on the wheel was ironclad, his breathing heavy, nostrils flaring like a man being forced to swallow his own pride. Reeves, still on the phone with his superior, nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. We understand. We'll release him immediately. His voice was tight, humiliated. Daniels turned in his seat and glared at Jamal. Get out. Jamal raised a brow, his hands still cuffed behind him. Unless you expect me to break out of these myself, you might want to do your job properly, Sergeant. Daniels looked like he wanted to punch something, but he grabbed his keys and yanked the cuffs off with unnecessary force. The cold steel clattered against the seat as he tossed them aside. Jamal rubbed his wrists, exhaling slowly. He had handled dozens of wrongful arrest cases in court, but tonight he was living proof of how deep the problem ran. You can keep the cuffs, he said, stepping out of the car. Consider them a souvenir. Reeves looked away, ashamed. Daniels, however, still burned with resentment. He leaned out of the window, his voice low and bitter. "You think you won something tonight?" Jamal adjusted his suit jacket, meeting Daniels' gaze without fear. "No, Sergeant. I think you lost something. Your reputation, your credibility, and possibly your job." Daniels' jaw twitched. "You got off lucky." Jamal let out a small, humorless chuckle. "No, you did, because if I were any other man, without the connections, without the title, you and I both know how this would have ended." Daniels said nothing. Jamal gave them one last look before pulling his phone back to his ear. "Elijah, I'm free. I'll be in touch soon, but first," he glanced back at the officers, eyes narrowing. "This isn't over." Daniels swallowed hard. Reeves closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for the storm to come. Jamal walked away, but the battle had only just begun. Jamal strode down the quiet street, rolling his shoulders to shake off the lingering stiffness from the cuffs. The night air was cooler now, but his blood still ran hot. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who didn't have a U.S. Attorney General for a brother. His phone was still pressed to his ear. "Elijah, I assume you're handling this?" "Already in motion," Elijah said, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "The police chief is scrambling, but this won't be swept under the rug. You okay?" Jamal exhaled through his nose. "I will be. But this is bigger than just an apology. Those cops need to be held accountable, Daniels especially." "You're not wrong," Elijah said, "and trust me, the mayor and governor are furious. A wrongful arrest like this, of a civil rights attorney, with your last name, the press will eat them alive." Jamal smirked slightly. "Good. Let's make sure they do." A car screeched to a stop beside him. He turned just as his friend and fellow attorney, Maya Brooks, jumped out, her face tight with worry. "Jamal!" She grabbed his arms, scanning him like she was checking for injuries. "Are you all right? I just got your message." Jamal nodded. "I'm good, Maya. Just another day in America." She shook her head, furious. "This isn't just another day. You cannot let this slide." Jamal's smirk faded. "I don't intend to." He turned back to his phone. "Elijah, let's put some pressure on the department. I want Daniels and Reeves off the streets, and I want a press conference by tomorrow morning." Elijah hesitated. "Jamal, you sure you want to go this hard? You know how these things get twisted." Jamal's jaw tightened. "Exactly. And I refuse to let them control the narrative." Maya crossed her arms. "Then we need to make this loud. Call out the corruption, the racial profiling, everything." Jamal nodded. "That's the plan. Because this wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. This was about justice, and he was just getting started. By morning, the story had exploded. Every major news network picked up the headline. "Civil rights attorney wrongfully arrested. His brother, the U.S. Attorney General, demands justice." Cable news played the footage on a loop. Clips of Jamal Carter being shoved into the squad car, his calm but firm declaration of who he was, and the way the officers' expressions shifted once reality hit them. The public reaction was immediate and furious. In front of the D.C. Police Department, reporters gathered, microphones clutched in cold hands, cameras flashing. The department had no choice but to address the situation. Inside, Sergeant Daniels sat stiffly in the chief's office, his face pale as the police chief glared at him from across the desk. Reeves sat beside him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You idiots," the chief hissed, slamming a newspaper down in front of them. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Attorney General's brother?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "We didn't know." "That's the problem," the chief snapped. "You arrested a man for no damn reason." Daniels sat rigid, but Reeves finally spoke up. "Sir, I knew something was off. I told Sarge we should check his ID." The chief's glare deepened. "And yet, you still went through with it. Now, the mayor's breathing down my neck, the governor wants answers, and the Attorney General himself is calling for your badges." Daniel's nostrils flared. "This is just politics. We were doing our job." The chief leaned forward. "No, Daniels, this is racial profiling, and now it's national news." Outside, the crowd grew, and at the center of it all stood Jamal Carter, flanked by Maya Brooks and a group of fellow attorneys, preparing to speak. The world was listening, and Daniel's worst nightmare was about to begin. Jamal stood tall at the podium, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward him. The crowd outside the D.C. Police Department was buzzing with anticipation. Journalists, activists, and community members had all gathered, waiting to hear from the man at the center of the storm. Maya Brooks, standing at his side, leaned in. "Make it count." Jamal gave a small nod before clearing his throat. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "Last night I was arrested. Not because I broke the law, not because I was a suspect in a crime, but because I was a black man standing beside his own car." A murmur rippled through the crowd. My arrest wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of a larger, systemic issue, one that black and brown men face every day in this country. The only difference between me and countless others. He paused, letting his next words land hard. "I had the privilege of calling my brother, the U.S. Attorney General. But what about the people who don't have that privilege? What happens to them?" The crowd erupted in applause. Some raised fists in solidarity. Others held up signs. "Justice for Jamal. End racial profiling. Daniels must go." Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sergeant Daniels and Officer Reeves assumed guilt before innocence. They didn't check my ID. They didn't listen. They saw a black man and decided that was enough reason to arrest me. This is exactly why we fight. This is why we demand change." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Carter, what action are you taking against the officers involved?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Sergeant Daniels and Officer Reeves need to be held accountable. I am calling for their immediate termination, and I will be filing a formal civil rights lawsuit against the department. But more than that, I'm demanding real police reform, because this isn't just about me. This is about every black man who didn't have a camera watching, who didn't get to make a phone call before it was too late." The crowd cheered again. Maya leaned in. "Look at Daniels," she murmured. Jamal's gaze flickered to the police department entrance. Behind the glass doors, Sergeant Daniels stood watching, his face tense, his jaw locked. He knew his days on the force were numbered, and Jamal knew he wasn't done yet. Inside the D.C. Police Department, Sergeant Daniels was fuming. His fists clenched at his sides as he watched Jamal Carter rally the crowd outside. The chants of protesters echoed through the hallways, growing louder by the minute. "This is a damn circus," Daniels muttered under his breath. Chief Reynolds, arms crossed, leveled a hard stare at him. "No, Daniels, this is consequences," Daniels scoffed. "You're really going to throw me under the bus? I was doing my job." "No," the chief said, his voice sharp. "You were abusing your authority. And now the mayor, the governor, and half the damn country are demanding your badge. Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Daniels swallowed hard, his pride warring with the reality sinking in. Across the room, Officer Reeves sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap. He looked more exhausted than angry. The chief sighed, rubbing his temple. "Reeves, you're on unpaid suspension while we investigate. Subscribe if you're with Jamal." Reeves nodded slowly, accepting his fate. Then the chief turned back to Daniels. "And you? You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Daniels' face went red. "Leave? That's bullsh." "Careful," the chief warned, "because if it were up to the Attorney General, you'd already be fired. And if Jamal Carter moves forward with that lawsuit, you might lose a whole lot more than your badge." Daniels fell silent, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. Outside, Jamal was still speaking, his voice carrying through the department's windows. The pressure was building. The world was watching. And Daniels knew this wasn't over. Not for him was on the line. And worse, it wasn't just the department coming for him. It was the Attorney General of the United States. The hallway buzzed with whispers. Other officers kept their heads down as he passed, avoiding his gaze. Even those who might have sided with him knew better than to align themselves with a sinking ship. He pushed open the back exit, stepping into the alley beside the precinct. He needed air, needed to think. But the second he stepped outside, he came face to face with Jamal Carter. Jamal leaned casually against a parked black sedan, arms crossed. Next to him, Maya Brooks stood with her phone out, recording. Daniels stiffened. "What the hell do you want?" Jamal didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, studying the man in front of him. Daniels wasn't just angry, he was scared. "You look stressed, Sergeant," Jamal finally said. Daniels scoffed. "Don't act like you didn't plan this whole damn thing. You wanted to make an example out of me." Jamal tilted his head. "No, you made an example out of yourself. I just made sure people saw it." Daniels clenched his fists. "This isn't justice. This is politics. Jamal took a slow step forward. Justice is accountability, Daniels. And for once in your life, you're feeling it. Daniel's jaw twitched. So what now? You ruin my career? Destroy my life? What do you want from me? Jamal held his gaze. I want you to understand something. What happened to me last night? It happens every damn day to men who don't have the power to fight back. You got unlucky because you picked the wrong black man. But this fight isn't just about me. It's about all the people you did get away with profiling. Daniels looked away. For the first time, he didn't have a sharp comeback. Jamal took another step closer, lowering his voice. You think this is the worst thing that's ever happened to you? You think losing your badge is unfair? Imagine what it's like losing your life over a cop's mistake. Daniels exhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, shoulders tense, trapped in a situation he couldn't control. Jamal let the silence hang for a moment longer, then stepped back. Enjoy your leave, Sergeant. If you're lucky, that's all you'll lose. Without another word, Jamal turned and walked away. Maya stopped, recording, and gave Daniels a lingering look. Think about what he said. Then she followed Jamal. Daniels stood there, fists at his sides, his world unraveling. For the first time in his life, he was the one who felt powerless. By the next morning, the headlines had shifted from outrage to action. Civil rights attorney Jamal Carter files federal lawsuit against D.C. Police Department. Attorney General supports brothers' fight for justice, calls for sweeping reform. Sergeant Daniels on leave could face criminal charges. The momentum was undeniable. The lawsuit wasn't just about Jamal's wrongful arrest, it was about systemic racism in policing, about the thousands of men who didn't get a second chance. And it had the full weight of the Attorney General's office behind it. In a sleek law office downtown, Jamal and Maya sat at a long conference table, surrounded by a team of top civil rights attorneys. Legal documents were spread before them. Maya tapped a stack of papers. The department is scrambling. They know they can't win this in court. My guess? They'll offer you a settlement soon. Jamal shook his head. I don't want their money. I want policy changes. Body cam requirements, independent investigations into racial profiling, mandatory de-escalation training, real reform. One of the older attorneys nodded. We can leverage the lawsuit to push for exactly that, but it won't be easy. The police union will fight us every step of the way. Jamal smirked. Let them try. We have the law, the press, and the people on our side. Maya leaned forward. Also, there's something else. I pulled Daniel's record. Jamal's brows lifted. And, she slid a file across the table, he has 6 prior complaints for excessive force, 3 of them against black men, all swept under the rug, no disciplinary action. Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line. Not this time. Just then, his phone buzzed. A text from Elijah. Elijah, the governor just called. We need to talk. Things are moving fast. Jamal exhaled. Looks like we just hit another level. Maya smiled. Good, let's make them sweat. The war had officially begun, and Jamal Carter wasn't backing down. Sergeant Daniels sat in his dimly lit apartment, a half-empty whiskey glass in front of him. His phone buzzed for the 5th time in the last hour. It was his union rep. He ignored it. His world was crumbling. First, the department distanced itself from him. Then, the mayor publicly condemned his actions. Now, there were whispers that the district attorney was considering criminal charges. A knock at the door startled him. He hesitated, then opened it to find Officer Reeves standing there, looking uneasy. Mind if I come in? Reeves asked. Daniels sighed and stepped aside. Make it quick. Reeves glanced around the cluttered apartment before speaking. Daniels, they're going to throw you under the bus. Daniels scoffed, rubbing his face. I know. You should talk, Reeves said. Daniels frowned. Talk? To who? Reeves sat down, his voice low. The feds. The Attorney General's office. They're digging deep, and if they find out about the other complaints against you... Daniel's stomach twisted. Those were handled internally. Reeves shook his head. Not anymore. The media is all over this, and Carter's lawsuit is forcing them to reopen cases. They want someone to take the fall, and it's going to be you. Daniels stared at him, the weight of those words settling in. If you cooperate, Reeves continued, you might be able to cut a deal. But if you stay silent, they'll make an example out of you. Daniels ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. But now, The system was moving on without him, and for the first time, he realized he was just another pawn in a game he never truly controlled. The courtroom was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters whispered hurriedly into microphones, and activists filled the benches. The case had captured national attention. Jamal Carter versus the D.C. Police Department. At the plaintiff's table, Jamal sat with Maya and his legal team. Across from them, the city's lawyers looked tense. The air buzzed with anticipation. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Sergeant Daniels walked in, flanked by his own attorney. But something was different. Instead of the defiant, angry officer Jamal had confronted days ago, Daniels looked resigned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Daniels approached the witness stand and was sworn in. Jamal leaned forward, watching closely. The city's lawyer hesitated before asking, "Sergeant Daniels, can you confirm whether racial profiling was a common practice within your department?" Daniels exhaled heavily. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Yes." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged the gavel. Jamal's pulse quickened. This was it. Daniels continued, his voice steady but low. "I profiled Jamal Carter that night, not because he was acting suspiciously, but because he was a black man in an upscale neighborhood. And I wasn't the only officer who operated that way. It was an unspoken rule. We knew who we were expected to target." Gasps filled the room. The city's lawyer's face turned pale. Daniels kept going. "And it wasn't just me. There are officers still on the force who have done worse. The department covers for them. It always has." Jamal exchanged a glance with Maya. They had expected a fight, but instead they were getting a confession. When Daniels stepped down from the stand, the city's lawyers looked defeated. There was no more denying it. The lawsuit wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system. Days later, a settlement was reached. Millions of dollars in damages. New policies enacted, officers under investigation. But Jamal wasn't celebrating just yet. He knew this was just one battle in a much bigger war. As he walked out of the courthouse, Maya turned to him. "We actually did it." Jamal gave a small nod. "Yeah, but we're not done." She smirked. "Good, because I didn't become a lawyer just to settle." Jamal chuckled. "Neither did I." The cameras flashed, the chants outside grew louder, and as Jamal stepped up to the podium to address the press once more, he knew this wasn't just a victory, it was a warning, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The end.